Welcome to the Lowy Institute for today's Distinguished Speakers Series presentation by the Honourable Tony Abbott, Leader of the Federal Opposition. I'm Michael Wesley, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. We are delighted to welcome Mr Abbott to the Institute, an organisation that takes its independent, non-partisan remit extremely seriously. The Lowy Institute has no set position, philosophy or agenda on any policy issue. It is an institution that houses and supports scholars who have individual positions, philosophies and agendas on issues of national and international importance. It is an institution that provides a platform for leaders and opinion makers who have individual positions, philosophies and agendas on a range of policy issues. We are very proud to have built strong relationships with both sides of politics in Australia. Prime Minister John Howard opened the Lowy Institute's Bligh Street headquarters on the 31st of March 2005 and presented the inaugural Lowy Lecture on Australia in the World. Prime Minister Rudd spoke in our Distinguished Speakers Series last November. Mr Howard's last international policy advisor, Andrew Shearer, is today our Director of Studies. Prime Minister Paul Keating's last international policy advisor was my predecessor, Alan Gyngell. Just 2 weeks ago, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Julie Bishop, who's with us today, joined us for lunch here at the Lowy Institute. And about a month before that, Defence Minister John Faulkner came to lunch. Senator Russell Trude, who is with us today, wrote an extremely well-received Lowy Institute paper on the emerging global order. We value our strong links to both sides of politics in Australia because we think it is of vital importance to that the political process in Australia takes international affairs seriously. As I argued in a book I wrote about the Howard government's foreign policy, we need to question the assumption that bipartisanship on all aspects of foreign policy is an unquestioned positive. I argued that foreign policy was one area in which a genuine difference in philosophy and approach has opened up between Coalition and Labor, and that the resulting contest of ideas and approaches is a good thing for the advancement of this nation's interests internationally. And so we are extremely delighted to have the Leader of the Federal Opposition come to talk to us today about Australia's national security fundamentals. Tony Abbott has been Leader of the Liberal Party and Leader of the Federal Opposition since the 1st of December 2009. He has degrees from Sydney University and Oxford University, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. He was elected member for Warringah at a by-election in March 1994. Prior to entering Parliament, Mr Abbott was Executive Director of Australians for a Constitutional Monarchy. From 1990 to 93, he was Press Secretary and Political Advisor to the Leader of the Opposition, Dr John Hewson. His previous career was in journalism, where he wrote as a feature writer for the Bulletin and the Australian. On the election of the Howard government in 1996, he was appointed Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Employment, Education, Training and Youth Affairs. In January 2001, Mr Abbott was promoted to Cabinet as Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and Small Business. Subsequently, he served as Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, Leader of the House and then Minister for Health and Ageing. On going into opposition, Mr Abbott became Shadow Minister for Families, Community Services, Indigenous Affairs and the Voluntary Sector. He published his third book, Battle Lines, in July 2009. Mr Abbott, welcome to the Lowy Institute.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's great to be here. It's good to be in the company of my distinguished friends and colleagues, the Deputy Leader, Julie Bishop, Senator Russell Trude. I believe Senator David Johnson is here as well. I'm tempted to, Louise Marcus, I'm tempted to start going through some of the faces in the audience. It's invidious, but I obviously have to acknowledge the presence of Owen Harries and, of course, distinguished members of the Lowy family, Frank, David and Stephen. This institute is a tribute to your commitment to our country, and it is a sign of the tremendous citizenship that you have displayed. We are lucky to have a family which has been of such tremendous broad benefaction to our country. This is my first significant speech on defence and foreign policy since becoming the Leader of the Opposition. As the Leader of the party, obviously it is my challenge to rise to areas of expertise and understanding that haven't been my forte in the past. It's always an interesting challenge, and I hope I can rise to it as all of you would expect. And as we meet today, ladies and gentlemen, in numerous places around the world, members of Australia's armed forces are undertaking the tasks that they have performed over decades, fighting alongside our allies, keeping the peace between local warlords, upholding the universal decencies and advancing Australia's national interests. This is the tradition that we will formally commemorate on Sunday. It is a hard but necessary job. Our readiness to support our military personnel in their sacrifice marks us as a serious country that does not shirk the difficult decisions on which the future of the world so often turns. The most sombre discussion that I have ever participated in was the Howard Cabinet's deliberations about the invasion of Iraq. Putting people's lives on the line is about the most grievous matter a government can consider, because inevitably the charge will be made that it's others who must pay the price of the government's principles. Still, I never doubted that it was the right decision. Saddam Hussein was a monster who had waged aggressive war against his neighbours, practiced genocide against his own people, sponsored terrorism against Israel, and defied numerous binding resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. As well, it was then thought he was arming himself with nuclear and biological weapons to unleash against his enemies. If the use of force could ever be justified, other than in immediate self-defence, this was surely such a case. For me, it was not the fact of our involvement, but its scale that was the issue. Australia's participation, though potent, was proportionately far smaller than, for instance, in the 1917 campaign to drive the Turks from Palestine, or the 1941 campaign to drive the Italians from North Africa. Of course, it would have been better had there been a further UN resolution, more countries involved, more surely based intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, and above all, a less unpitying subsequent civil war. Even so, the emergence of a pluralist and relatively liberal Iraq, should it be sustained, would be a truly historic breakthrough with beneficial consequences right around the world. It would reflect well on the common interests and fundamental decency of the Iraqi people, and also on the judgment and commitment of the countries whose sacrifices had brought about this demonstration that democratic pluralism can emerge even in the least promising circumstances. There were a number of occasions when the former government decisively intervened in the affairs of other countries. There was the military commitment to the Solomon Islands when they were on the verge of anarchy. There was the more locally contested and less sustained civil commitment to Papua New Guinea to strengthen the governance of our nearest neighbour. There was the massive aid and relief effort to Indonesia in the wake of the East Asian tsunami. All of these were evidence of Australia's determination to be a force for good in the wider world and resolve not to leave to others the high task of working for the betterment of mankind wherever we could lend a helping hand. Above all, there was our contribution to the liberation of East Timor. At one level, this was justice for a people yearning to be free. At another, it was the repayment of a historic debt to those who had rescued and harboured Australians during World War II. Australia encouraged Indonesia to hold a plebiscite on independence, worked furiously to secure Indonesian consent and UN authorisation for a multinational intervention to stop the subsequent violence, and led the force which secured for the fledgling nation at least a shaky peace. The 1999 task force deployed to East Timor was tiny compared to the 5 divisions of the 1st Australian Imperial Force sent to Europe, or the 4 divisions of the 2nd AIF to North Africa and Malaya. Still, it was the first international military campaign which Australia had instigated and led. It was the first time that Australia had initiated a stand for right, rather than simply participated in campaigns that other countries had led. After some hesitation, America lent its diplomatic weight and logistical support, while Britain unquestioningly put a battalion under Australian command. It was the first serious sign that we would no longer leave primarily to others the task of upholding what Australians regard as universal values, at least in our own region. The former government's extensive overseas commitments, both military and civil, reflected its understanding that Australia's security depended as much on the prevalence of its values as on the extensiveness of its dealings. The best protection, for instance, against Islamist terrorism is the widest possible appreciation of individuals' right to religious, political and economic freedom. The best protection, for instance, against great power bullying is the widest possible appreciation that might is not necessarily right. In the long term, Australia's freedom and prosperity rides on ethical principles, which it is our national imperative to sustain and advance. At a national, no less than at an individual level, the world's welfare is best promoted by the widest possible acceptance of the principle that we should act towards others as we'd have them act towards us. Australia's participation in an international community of values is no less important than our involvement in trade deals and security alliances. Indeed, trade and security arrangements are so much easier to sustain when they are based on a common understanding of how the world should work. This is why our most important international partners are likely to be the countries with which we share an outlook rather than those with which we share merely the neighbourhood or mercantile self-interest. Of course, like-minded neighbours and near neighbours with whom we have strong trade and security relationships are naturally the best friends of all. Australia's external policies should be based on a rigorous analysis of our national interest and the challenges to it. That analysis, though, needs a values dimension as well as the more standard economic and security considerations. Judgments about where those interests lie must stem from perceptions of the wider world and Australia's place in it. With whom and over what can we make common cause? Who are Australia's real friends and how can we have more of them? What are the real threats to our security and prosperity and how can they be minimised? Islamist terrorism remains a deadly threat, not only to the West, but also to India, Russia, China and moderate Muslim states. Nuclear proliferation is a harrowing further consideration, especially in relation to Iran, whose leadership has threatened to wipe Israel off the map, North Korea, which has conducted 2 nuclear tests and is indiscriminately exporting nuclear know-how, and Pakistan, a nuclear power at risk of becoming a failed state dominated by Islamists. Unregulated and increasingly voluminous people movements will test border security and immigration policies around the world, especially for the magnet countries of the West and transit countries like Indonesia. As well, there's the need to create and sustain a manageable environment in which deforestation is reduced and greater energy and food security is achieved. Still, there are grounds for guarded optimism. Despite setbacks, democracy largely continues to consolidate in the former Soviet bloc, Latin America and most of Asia. Current economic problems notwithstanding, for the foreseeable future, the United States is likely to remain the preeminent power internationally, including in the Asia-Pacific region, and an immense force for good in the wider world. The greater economic strength of the Asia-Pacific should mean more opportunities for Australia. Despite the now dissipating international financial crisis, globalised technological progress continues and our trading partners are recovering. So given these global trends and challenges, Where do Australia's interests lie? Australia's interests lie wherever there is an economic opportunity to be taken, a citizen to be protected, or a value to be upheld. They always have, they always will. The task of the Australian Government remains what it has always been: to expand our prosperity, to enhance our security, to promote our way of life, and to manage the tensions between these objectives. Australian interests are not synonymous with Australian territory or confined to our region. Asserting them requires a global web of political and economic relationships. Wherever Australian businesses can legitimately be helped, citizens are at risk, or values can be advanced, the Australian Government should be alert for opportunities to help, as well as to the unintended consequences of well-intentioned actions. Australia's economic strength and technological sophistication gives us more influence than most countries of our size, and the potential to play a significant role in our own region and beyond. The universal resonance of Western values gives Australia both an opportunity and a responsibility to exercise influence as the key Western country in the Asia-Pacific region. The Howard government understood that the Anglosphere was the heart of the Western Alliance and sensed Australia's responsibilities and potential standing as a participant in it. Over the past decade, our military involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq has deepened our alliance with the United States, revitalised our military and broader security links with Britain, and reinforced our significance in the region and the wider world. The Howard government did not focus on traditional alliances alone, but built on the authority they gave us to develop strong strategic ties with other key powers that share our democratic values, including Japan, India and Indonesia. The Howard government appreciated that Australia's national interest could not be pursued oblivious to the big issues of the wider world. It understood, as I'm sure the Rudd government does too, that Australia has a clear interest in advancing freedom in democracy and in eradicating poverty. One country can hardly transform the planet, but especially in our immediate region, we have a particular obligation to conduct our national security policies consistently with our values. Australia's recent work in East Timor not only exemplifies this approach, but also illustrates how perceptions of our international role have changed. This would have been a mission inconceivable in the period from Whitlam to Keating, when we were much more equivocal about standing up for our values on the global stage. Australia's big overseas military deployments of the past decade have reflected our national interests and our national values. It is in Australia's interest to be a reliable military ally. It's in our national character not to let down our friends when they need our help. It was in Australia's clear security interest to help the US to evict Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, where some of the terrorists who later killed 88 Australians in Bali had trained. Australia retains a clear interest in denying to terrorists the use of Afghanistan as a secure base. It's easy now to deride the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but all the main intelligence agencies, the French and the Russians, no less than the Americans and Israelis, thought that Saddam had them, and his statements and behaviour reinforced that conclusion. No less an authority than the former Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Kevin Rudd, thought that Saddam possessed them. In neither intervention was Australia seeking to export democracy, although the removal of abhorrent regimes necessitated the establishment of freer and fairer societies. The enthusiastic participation of Afghans and Iraqis in great numbers in multi-party elections, despite lethal intimidation, suggests that the desire for freedom and democracy is not a mere Western conceit. Australians should be proud of the part we have played in achieving this, and grateful to the United States for its preparedness to take huge risks in a good cause. It is easy to question the United States' tactics and sometimes its judgment, but almost never its good intentions. It is not Australia's role to be an unquestioning ally. Still, America's habitual critics should more often consider to which other country or body they would rather entrust a solution to the world's troubles. Were Australia to be directly threatened, America would primarily consider its own national interest rather than ours. We could never take American help for granted. Still, the stronger an ally we are in American struggles, the more sure an ally they should be in ours. Alliance considerations are not the most important reason for Australia's military commitment to Afghanistan, but they're not insignificant either. Quite apart from the fact that America's values are invariably ours, and that America's interests are mostly ours too, there's the mutual obligation dimension that any friendship involves. Australia's service personnel have performed magnificently in Afghanistan. Our special forces in particular have enhanced their reputation as amongst the world's best. We mourn the 11 young Australians who have lost their lives there and call to mind the more than 90 who have been wounded in the line of duty and their loved ones. We best honour these soldiers and ensure that their sacrifices will not be in vain by securing the victory for which they fought. It was my privilege in Darwin recently to meet some of the officers and men of the 1st Brigade. Some of them were preparing for deployment overseas. Many had been on several overseas deployments, including to Iraq and Afghanistan. The modern Australian soldier is a teacher, technician and envoy, as well as a warrior. The most up-to-date professionalism has supplemented the traditional Anzac spirit. It was also my privilege to meet a crew engaged in patrolling our northern waters. Dealing compassionately yet firmly with the range of people seeking entry to Australia demands a modern version of that chivalry which our service personnel seem amply to possess. We expect a great deal of them, and they have a right to know that the Australian people are firmly behind them. It's fitting that the Rudd government has maintained its predecessor's military commitment to Afghanistan and even slightly increased troop numbers following the withdrawal of most Australian forces from Iraq. It was, after all, Mr Rudd and his political colleagues who described Afghanistan as the central front in the war against terror. But the extent of our commitment to Afghanistan is once more in question now that the Dutch, who currently take the lead in Oruzgan province, are preparing to withdraw their 1,900 troops as well as their F-16 fighter bombers, helicopters, tanks and hospital later this year. The Rudd government has said that it is unwilling and unable to take command in the province and to increase our commitment, even to approach the current Dutch contribution. It would be a poor reflection on our defence capabilities and value as an ally if we are truly unable to help. Certainly General Jim Molan, the Australian former Chief of Operations for the multinational force in Iraq, says that we could and should take the lead in Oruzgan province. It's no secret that the Americans would like additional Australian forces and have refrained from making a formal request only because they have been told that it would be unwelcome. The government should explain why it's apparently right that NATO countries should commit more troops, but not Australia. Putting more troops at risk is not a decision that any Australian government should lightly make, but the near certainty of higher casualties has to be weighed against the consequences of failing to shoulder extra responsibilities and the ramifications of any collective loss of nerve by Western powers. How fair is it to leave Australia's security so much in the hands of other countries' soldiers, or to expect America and Britain to do nearly all the free world's heavy lifting? If satisfied that the role made strategic sense and was compatible with our other military commitments, a coalition government would be prepared to consider doing more.